Star Trek, a franchise that's held a major standing in the science fiction landscape for generations, the inspiration for many series and many stories after it. In my mind, maybe some of yours too, there's what I like to call the science fiction big three. These series are the longest running science fiction franchises that have had the most impact, at least on television and film in the West. These three being Star Wars, Doctor Who, and of course, Star Trek. These franchises' impacts are undeniable, and yet it seems like Star Trek has gained a sort of stigma for younger generations of watchers. Maybe it's just me, but I've heard so many people of my age describe Star Trek as too nerdy for them. This dilemma confuses me greatly since nerd stuff is quite literally the mainstream culture, at least right now. Allow me to put it like this. If you're willing to watch a show with scenes like this,
how's it going?
Reversing the polarity of the neutron flow. But that means something. It sounds great.
or a movie with stuff like this,
You are on this council, but we do not grant you the rank of master.
What? How can you do this? This is outrageous. It's unfair.
made a D&D character sheet, or even lost 40 plus hours to a Cyberpunk 2077 playthrough, then I hate to say it, but Star Trek is not too nerdy for you. In fact, sorry to all the Doctor Who fans. Trust me, I'm one too. I made a feature-length video of Doctor Who fan fiction, for crying out loud. But Doctor Who is far nerdier in comparison to Star Trek. So, why is it that Star Trek has acquired this weird stigma? Simple. Star Trek's last decade or so has not been the greatest. It's not been completely irredeemable, but it's just been all over the board in terms of quality and just what people want. Paramount has no clue what they want to do with this franchise, which is a shame since it was the premier science fiction franchise on television. But now one minute we're getting a show that completely ruins the ideas and concepts of a classic series, a new TV series that's written like a CW drama, and a reboot trilogy of the original Star Trek series that's basically trying to be Star Wars. JJ, get out of here already! This is like the 4th or 5th franchise you've tried to reboot. Okay, it's not completely terrible. I like that first J.J. Abrams Star Trek film fine enough. It's a nice 3.5 to 4 stars out of 5. And I've heard that new animated series is good, but I haven't seen it yet. But genuinely, if you think Star Wars had a rough 2010s, then you really don't know how low it can get. The Rise of Skywalker is still worse than any bad thing Star Trek has produced though. Though, maybe there's hope. Supposedly, a lot of people around my age are starting to reject this newer Trek that Paramount has been putting out, instead watching clips of the classic series that they've produced. Hey, everyone's gotta start somewhere. Don't judge people for how they get into something. I've actually gotten a lot of these clips on my YouTube feed too, and it made me go, man, I haven't watched The Next Generation in a bit. I should do that for a video sometime. Which led me here, but then I remembered, oh yeah, that's like 7 seasons of TV. I don't know if I can fill that into like one video. And this is where we get to the general premise of this video. One of my favorite YouTubers, BH Ultra. If somehow BH Ultra comes across this video in his timeline, yes, I completely stole your video concept. You see, Mr. Ultra here, can I call you that? Can I call you Mr. Ultra? They made a video covering the first 2 seasons of Star Wars The Clone Wars, another one of my favorite shows that's also pretty lengthy. Basically, he talks about the series and talks about how the Clone Wars watch guide is pretty wrong, which I respect. I do think some people take watch guides far too seriously, especially the Clone Wars one. That one kinda sucks, I'm not gonna lie. How the hell can you skip the goated Blue Shadow virus? What's wrong with you? Anyways, I do think watch guides can have merit though, especially for series that are passing the 3-season mark. So that's kinda what I planned on doing for this video. Talking about my experience watching Star Trek The Next Generation Seasons 1 and 2, or at least the episodes I felt merited discussion, while also providing for you guys not a watch guide, but a sort of sample platter or a starter pack. Easy episodes to watch for a beginner if you want to get into Star Trek, because honestly, it deserves more love nowadays. And I genuinely believe more people would absolutely love this series if they just gave it a fair shot. Now, to address the avid Trekkies that are probably watching this video, some of you may be wondering why I chose The Next Generation. I mean, let's keep it a buck. TNG is the best place for anyone to start. I love the original series a ton, but I feel like it might not connect with everyone because it was made in the early 60s and some of its cracks can show at times. As for why I don't start people with the movies, while I do love a lot of them, I feel like starting with the movies and their higher sense of scale can give people the wrong idea about Trek. Trek, a lot of the time, is pretty down to earth, having many episodes where the characters just hang out around the ship and enjoy each other's company. And I think TNG encapsulates all these ideas. Sure, maybe some later series like Deep Space Nine have deeper episodes and more complex stories, but I don't want to drop people off on the deep end of the pool. It's just a bad idea, and I don't want to jump scare anyone with some mind-bending weirdness too early. Unless you're into that weird mind-bendy sci-fi stuff like I am. And now with all that out of the way, just one final thing. I'm gonna rate each episode I talk about on a scale to 1 to 5 phasers. Phasers are the little weapons the crew uses. Anyways, this is basically a star system. 0 to 1 phasers mean it's a bad to awful episode, and 5 phasers mean it's a great episode, if not a peak episode of Trek. Or maybe even in all of science fiction. Enough yapping. I think it's time for us to start talking about Star Trek The Next Generation Seasons 1 and 2. Engage! Originally in the script, I was just going to jump in and start talking about the seasons and episodes themselves, but then I had a thought. If I'm going to recommend the series to newcomers who probably don't know much about Trek at all outside of like the visual aesthetics and such, shouldn't I introduce the main ideas of the series and the main cast? Which I then decided, yes, I should. But I'll try to keep it brief and get into the good stuff pretty fast. So here's the general premise. In the 24th century, there was an organization called Starfleet. In this future, a lot of our modern problems have been solved. No more bigotry of any kind exists on a wide scale. Nobody is poor or needy because of capitalistic bullshit. And because of that, many humans and our extraterrestrial allies set out to explore the stars. And really, Starfleet's main goal is to explore our universe and learn as much as they can about it, as well as helping out where they can. Imagine Starfleet as a mix between something like the Red Cross and something like a Union of Explorers. Something like that. However, Starfleet does have one doctrine they follow, the Prime Directive. Basically, while it is good to help, Starfleet does not want to manipulate or warp other cultures to their whims. They are not imperialistic in the slightest, or at least they try not to be. And there's many episodes where the crew debates whether they should even get involved with something because sometimes they have no right to be involved in another culture. And yes, this is meant to be a commentary on how America back then, and still to this day, forces involvement into issues they weren't originally involved in for their own gain or because of our sense of morality. I said that with air quotes. You probably can't see that, but I said that with air quotes. Of course, there's a lot of nuances to this, as well as a ton of well thought out lore, factions, and species to be talked about. But I don't want to make a 2-hour long video. It's probably long enough as it is anyway. For now, let's talk about the main crew of the Enterprise. First up, we have Jean-Luc Picard, played by Patrick Stewart. Probably the most famous actor out of the series, and in fact, this was Stewart's breakout role into the mainstream. At least to my knowledge. Picard is a well-composed leader, wanting to do things by the book and keeping everything ethical. Probably one of the most competent leaders I've seen in all of fiction. You'd think at first he's this grumpy, middle-aged guy, and he definitely can be that. But you'll soon learn that he's a genuinely super caring guy and takes his leadership role incredibly seriously. The next character I gotta mention is Commander William T. Riker, played by Jonathan Frakes. He's Picard's right-hand guy and first officer, nicknamed by Picard as Number 1. Yet he and Picard have quite different personalities and leadership styles. Riker tends to be a bit more on the fast and loose side, a lot closer to the captain of the original series, Captain Kirk. A younger guy with a lot to learn, but also a lot of experience and knows how to get a team together. Riker is usually the guy getting involved in all the action and cool shootouts and stuff like that. I wanted to save this guy for last, but here's Data, played by Brent Spiner. Look, among the Trek fan base, he's one of the most beloved characters in the whole series. He's probably my favorite character, from this series at least. Data is an android, one of the first of his kind if I remember correctly, and thus we watch as Data grows as a person and learns more about who he is as he explores the cosmos on the Enterprise. We see him learning the meaning of comedy, fun, and so much more. Plus he's funny as hell, there's a lot of good gags related to Data. Of course, we can't go through all that and not talk about Geordi LaForge, played by LeVar Burton. Now, if you're around my age, you'll probably know Burton better if you watched Reading Rainbow as a kid. What's crazy is that he was actually doing both shows at the same time for a while. Damn, it's like the more I learn about LeVar Burton, the cooler he gets. Geordi is the main engineer of the Enterprise, and you've probably noticed those odd glasses-looking things on Geordi's face. Well, that's because Geordi's blind, but he uses this machine to help him see. And not gonna lie, as a disabled person myself, Geordi is one of the best examples of writing a disabled character I've seen on TV. But Geordi is rarely defined by his disability. I'd go as far to say Geordi is the most down-to-earth character of the cast. He's super competent and is a science genius, but he's also the most honest, earnest, and relatable character of the cast. It's incredible writing too that they pair him up with Data. These two always make a good pair. After this, we have Worf, played by Michael Dorn. Worf is the security officer of the crew, and definitely the most stoic one. You see, Worf is a Klingon and is the first ever Klingon to join Starfleet. Now, that's a massive deal because in all the stories before TNG, the Klingons in Starfleet were always in a sort of Cold War. But now peace has been brokered and there's a lot more interactions between the two. Of course, there's usually moral clashes. Starfleet tends to run more on ethics and logic, while Klingons tend to reward honor and trial by combat. Because of this, Worf tends to be put in situations where his Klingon identity and his allegiance to Starfleet can be at odds. But don't let that fool you. Worf isn't just some violent monster or anything, even if he likes a good fight here and there. Now let's talk about Dr. Beverly Crusher, played by Gates McFadden. I don't know if I pronounced that right, I'm sorry if I didn't. She's the Enterprise's medical doctor and tends to be one of the most compassionate and empathetic members of the crew. Not that the others aren't, but as a doctor, she tends to tackle ideas and concepts through a much more empathetic lens. She adds a ton to the crew and can even break through a lot more of the logic-driven thinking that's been done on the Enterprise. She's incredibly headstrong, but knows when to not push far. Of course, with Dr. Crusher, we have her son Wesley, played by Will Wheaton. He's a young teen who's joined with Starfleet Academy and is positioned on the Enterprise alongside his mother. Wesley is, like many young teens, trying to find his own way in the world and still trying to solidify exactly the type of person he is. Another one of the crew's main members is Counselor Deanna Troi, played by Marina Sirtis. Troi is half human, half betazoid, and due to her betazoid half, she is a literal empath. She can sense the thoughts and emotions of others, using her psychic abilities to help her crew and allow them to emotionally keep themselves upright. She's a very nurturing and caring person, which is fair since she's basically the group therapist. Though, don't let her soft and stereotypically feminine traits fool you. She's a strong and powerful person, despite coming off as passive. She knows how to get into high gear. Next, I want to talk about Guinan, played by Whoopi Goldberg. Probably the most accomplished actor when joining this show, she actually joins the crew a bit later. And while she doesn't appear as often as the other crew, her impact on the series is so massive that I felt like I needed to include her. Guinan is an ageless, ancient alien who usually imparts wisdom upon the rest of the crew, though she isn't a Starfleet member. To explain a bit, the Enterprise does carry civilians. It's sort of a half cruise ship, half exploration vessel, but she runs the bar of the ship, being the sort of grounded, wise bartender that you might find in real life. And last, but certainly not least, Q, played by John D. Lancey. Q is one of the few recurring antagonists of the Star Trek series. He's sort of this trickster being, a god or higher entity we don't really know much about. But when Q is involved, you could be ready for a fun time. He just absolutely loves to troll Picard in particular, getting under his tough skin and testing his morals. Imagine someone like Mr. Mxyzptlk from Superman, but even more of a troll. But yeah, sorry for the yapping, but TNG is a pretty character-centric show, and I wanted to give you all an idea of the characters in the world without just saying things that expect you to know what the hell I'm talking about. So, now we get right into the sauce. Starting with Season 1. Out the gate, TNG had a rough first season. Of course, most shows' first seasons are usually the worst, but for TNG, there was a lot of background drama and issues appearing all the time. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of the series, got into arguments with the studio, writers, and so on pretty often. He wasn't the main issue, but it was more so just a ton of problems due to everyone wanting to put their fingers in the pot. That and apparently a few fraudulent actions were taken by Roddenberry's lawyer. That's not even a joke. This season was hell on everyone involved, and it shows in the product. I simply can't go on about it because it would make the runtime of this video even longer than it probably needs to be, but one of my favorite YouTubers, Roman J. Coleman, goes over it well in his video about TNG. I'll link that somewhere around here. Go check it out after this video, obviously. Please watch this video first, and then watch his, though it's probably gonna have a ton of spoilers. All this is to say, if you're surprised to not see many episodes mentioned about Season 1, well, I'm not gonna hide it, it's pretty rough. But let's just warp on into it. Ah yes, the pilot, which was actually a massive two-parter. A feature-length episode, and yeah, it's a long episode. It's usually tradition that the first episode of a science fiction series starts with a double-length episode, but the issue is that this was never intended with TNG. In fact, it only became a standard after The Next Generation. Yes, Paramount was fiending for a feature-length premiere. Thus, they basically forced the writers to squish 2 episodes together into one long episode, and it really shows. The pacing can be very stop and go. What it does mostly well is introducing us to the new world of the show. Mind you, this series was being made after 3 seasons of the original series, an animated series, and 6 entire films all covering the original crew. So they had to sell everyone on the concept of a next generation. And for the most part, I think they succeed with a couple bumps in the road. We get a good read of much of our primary crew, excluding Worf, I'd say. He doesn't really get to do much here. But they also go out of their way to show that this cast isn't just Kirk, Spock, and Bones 2.0. Those are the guys from the original show. Instead, they're all their own unique characters, but with familiar archetypes to Trek. They're just spun in different ways, of course. In many ways, both Worf and Data are similar to Spock's role in the first series, but are also their own unique characters. Interestingly, the closest character to Kirk is not Picard, but instead Riker. While Kirk was much more immediately passionate and leads by doing, Picard is automatically seen as more tenured, diplomatic, and leans into more methodical ideas. Though I'd say both are easily worthy of the title of Captain of the Enterprise. But you really gotta put up with the janky pacing. The main issue of Q's trial and the issue of Farpoint kind of being very loosely tied together. But for the shitty situation they were put into, I'd say they did the best they could. And they at least understand the appeal of Star Trek, which I think Picard says perfectly in his closing line. Let's see what's out there. Engage. So I think this deserves 3 phasers out of 5. This episode is important because it does introduce us to Starfleet Academy, as well as giving us more of a look into Wesley's character, showing us that Starfleet isn't just some military organization, but is instead showing that they teach people and allow them to grow and really try to flesh out everything they do. But this episode doesn't really do anything major either. I feel like there's definitely better episodes and child characters in all of Trek. Now, while this is important for lore and it does really show you the depths of the world we're in, the story itself is not anything to write home about. I would probably give this 2 phasers. This episode is carried heavily by its premise, but I like it. Essentially, the Enterprise crew encountered an abandoned world, once inhabited by some of the most powerful weapons manufacturers in the galaxy. Essentially, the Enterprise crew encounters an abandoned world, once inhabited by some of the most powerful weapons manufacturers of the galaxy. But now it's desolate. It creates an engaging puzzle, the crew having to interact with the automated defense system of the world. I don't want to spoil too much because there's really engaging and interesting ideas here. I feel like maybe there should have been more development of this concept, but overall it's pretty solid. I'm glad to see that the writers use this premise to actually do some character development, which Season 1 of TNG struggles with developing its characters. Geordi, for example, learns how to lead and has a slight but defining argument with a fellow crewmate. The struggle Picard and Crusher are put into also teaches us a lot about their characters as well, but mostly about how Crusher thinks and feels. You could really tell that the writers are starting to get into their rhythm and figuring out the setting and the characters. I'd say this is a good 3.5 phasers. Okay, so out the gate, this is probably the best episode of TNG Season 1, introducing us to a real moral issue that isn't super black and white, questioning the ethics of Starfleet in comparison to the crew. The Enterprise gets unintentionally involved with a conflict between 2 neighboring species in a star system. The Ondarans and the Brekkians have had a strange, tangled relationship for generations now. We learned that there was a plague that has been ravaging the Ondarans, and the only ones who can even create the cure are the Brekkians. Of course, the Brekkians just want them to pay for the cure, despite the fact that the Ondarans need the cure, or at least that's how it seems at first. I don't want to spoil much because it does make all the crew reflect on if they should even get involved, despite the fact that it's obvious the Brekkians are manipulating the Ondarans for many years now, and possibly might be doing even worse things to them. This episode has a lot of great ideas, concepts, and ethical focus, focusing on how one group of people can slowly manipulate other groups that are lower on the financial chain, as well as how the distribution of drugs can affect a community in so many ways. 4 phasers. I'ma just keep it a buck. I hate this episode. And looking back on it, I hate it even more than on first watch. If this episode was placed into any era or show of Star Trek, it would debatably be the worst episode of that show. I can't even take the villain seriously. It doesn't help that he has the same speech pattern of Macho Man Randy Savage, or he just sounds like a really bad, undercooked 80s wrestler. Like, the villain seems more like a petty child than an actual threat. I get they're going for a sort of unredeemable, petty, evil villain type character, but this character's just not interesting in this concept. It feels like a character from a I Think You Should Leave sketch. I couldn't help but laugh every time they spoke. The only reason why I'm putting this here is because, spoilers I guess for an episode that's terrible, there's an early character death here. Not saying who dies, of course, but there is an early character death here. But 1 phaser.
Bad episode.
Out of my face!
This episode is part of a long legacy of sci-fi stories about body takeovers. You know, invasion of the body snatchers and stuff like that. It's a trope I tend to really enjoy. When written well, it can make for a super thrilling plot where you don't know who to trust, which I think this episode does pretty well. Instead of taking the predictable route of having someone on the Enterprise be hijacked by an alien species, instead its higher-ups of Starfleet have fallen victim to a takeover scheme. This episode really explores Picard because he really is a guy who tries to do everything by the book. He's usually incredibly composed, and yet this is one of the few times we see him actually stumped. He doesn't know what to do because, on the one hand, why would Starfleet be doing all these things? On the other hand, Starfleet is basically his life. Would this not count as a betrayal? Also, there's this great guest star here with Michael Berryman, who you might know from The Hills Have Eyes. He just has this iconic look, and I think it fits very well for this series. Riker is the other star of the show, and it's great to see how he and Picard play off one another again. Again, Riker being a lot closer to Kirk in this series, he's way more risky and willing to bluff his way out of situations. In fact, I'd say he's the main reason the Enterprise even makes it out of here alive. There's a lot of great tension in this episode, but my only main gripe is that they make it pretty apparent who the bad guys are at the later points of the episode. It makes sense since these episodes are about 40 minutes maximum, but some more murkiness would have been great here. However, don't get it twisted. It's still a fun, solid episode. 4 phasers. This is another episode where its premise does carry it a lot. Essentially, the Enterprise crew are out in the neutral zone, which is a demilitarized zone that was established after the Federation, which is the general government Starfleet is part of, went to war with the Romulans. Yet, when out there, they find a derelict pod from centuries ago with people frozen inside. In a way, it has some actual overlap with the premise of Futurama, which is never a bad comparison since Futurama is like a top 5 science fiction series. We get an A and B plot structure, with the crew dealing with the, as usual, aggressive Romulans, while the rest of the crew have to deal with civilians from the later 21st century. Overall, a decent episode. I find both the A and B plot interesting, but they don't really seem to interact too much, not even thematically, which I feel like could have been used for some interesting thematic play here, with how these humans from the late 21st century could reflect how the Romulans haven't changed much at all since the war. It's like these two ideas are great separately, but not really good together. Which isn't inherently a bad thing, but I feel like there's a thread here that isn't explored or they're being too subtle about it. And yes, it's okay to not be subtle sometimes. Personally, I sort of wish this episode focused heavier on the people thought out from the past. It could make for a seriously heartbreaking drama. It doesn't really make the episode bad, I just feel like there could have been more. 3 phasers. So yeah, those are all the episodes from Season 1 that I think merited discussion. Now, Season 1 of TNG is not the worst season of television I've ever seen, so many other shows have that covered, but if there were 2 key phrases or words that I can apply here, they'd be these: inconsistent and struggling with the past. Look, the reason why so many episodes in the season struggle is because they are trying too hard to replicate that feeling of the original series, and quite frankly, TNG isn't that. We're so many years removed from what the original series was. The best episodes of the season are really just the appetizers for the best thought-provoking episodes later on. There's a reason why in this season there isn't much to talk about because genuinely so many of them are forgettable or almost unwatchable. However, despite what our modern streaming era tends to make us believe, that's okay if not completely natural for a show's first season to be its worst. It's the season where everyone is trying to find their footing, and luckily, I think TNG gets its feet on the ground a lot more firm the next season. Speaking of which, I know this may sound weird to some, but in my eyes, Season 2 of TNG is what I would call the true Season 1 of the series. What I mean is, like I said earlier, this is where we see the show finally start to come in its own. There's a phrase among Star Trek fans called growing the beard. This is meant to signify when a show within the series starts to find its own rhythm and identity, becoming the best version of itself. The phrase was coined because, well, Season 2 is when they let the actor of Riker grow out his beard. Okay, now that I can actually say it, it was so weird watching those first season episodes and seeing Riker without a beard. It's one of his most distinct visual traits. It'd be like having Spider-Man without a spider logo. It's just weird and off-putting. But here we're going to encounter a lot more iconic episodes that I say are much better starting points. Honestly, I usually wouldn't recommend this, but you really can skip most of Season 1 and just come straight here to Season 2. I don't think it would be as jarring to sit through. Though, let's get started with... Okay, I know I said Season 2 is better than Season 1, but I also wanted to show off this episode because there still are some stinkers in this lot. It also just happens to be the literal first episode of Season 2, and it might be one of my least favorite of the series. Honestly, I might just be talking about this episode to talk about how much I really don't like it. The only actual highlight of this episode is the introduction of Whoopi Goldberg as Guinan, who is one of the best characters in all of TNG, if not all of Star Trek. It just sucks that she has to be introduced in an episode with some... Screw the demonetization. This episode has some really rapey undertones, and I'm not saying that lightly. This episode feels gross to watch. I really wish Troy didn't have to go through such a terrible plot. But the Guinan appearance, I guess, is important to mention, though she does get much better episodes later on, so... screw it. 0 phasers, man. This episode sucks. Okay, so I'll be honest here. Data is probably my favorite Trek character of all time. At least top 3. But to be fair, he's one of the most beloved characters of the whole fandom, so, you know. But this episode in particular is such a great Data story. We get to see Data basically simulate Sherlock Holmes mysteries with his buddy Geordi, and this episode is an example of one of the greatest strengths of TNG. Just having episodes that center around the premises of characters hanging out or having fun. They even set up a fun way to create stakes for the story. Geordi basically telling Data that it's a bit boring to do all the Holmes cases that he already knows. He should ask the holodeck, that's the room on the ship that does the simulations by the way, to make a new case that would really test his mental abilities. Of course, Data being an android doesn't fully understand this at first, but goes along with it. From here, it actually becomes a super interesting mystery that also revolves around themes of sentience and learning about one's own existence. I don't want to say much more because I think it'll spoil the fun, but this is one of my favorite episodes of the whole series. 5 phasers. This episode is a great exploration of Klingon culture, but also shows us that Starfleet is actively trying to keep good relations with the Klingon. This is also a great Riker episode, showing us that he's the type of man who doesn't take a challenge with his head down. Essentially, this episode is built around the idea of a temporary crew exchange. A member of the Klingons goes into the Enterprise, and Riker goes onto a Klingon war vessel for a bit. And Riker goes all in on this. We see him trying to learn all the cultural words and even eating and trying as much Klingon cuisine as he can before getting on board. He doesn't go out of his way to judge the Klingons, but instead tries to learn from their culture and take part in it, instead of coming on with his arms crossed and going, "I'm part of Starfleet, I'm better than this," like a baby or a toddler or something. Of course, the plot does reach a boiling point and it does become a stressful scenario, but we get a good story out of it, and I really enjoy this kind of empathy that Riker brings to the Klingons instead of judging them as monsters and warmongers. It's really good stuff. 4 phasers. An iconic masterpiece of science fiction writing. No, seriously, I think it's really that good. It also takes a stance on the idea of artificial life, which I've not seen much other science fiction talk about. The only other science fiction I think I've seen take a similar stance to this is Software by Rudy Rucker, which you should read, it's really good. But if you're a Trekkie, you already know that this is an easy classic episode. If you're not, this is probably one of the best episodes to introduce anyone the TNG. No notes. 5 phasers. This episode has an interesting tone because while it is a tense situation, it also feels pretty comedic. Not that I'm complaining, I actually loved this episode. More or less, the Enterprise is being infected with a dangerous computer program. We start out with small comedic moments of the tech making mistakes before it goes fully out of control. It's great, slowly creating a sense of dread, starting a bit funny before making us realize that this is not funny in the slightest. And also, this episode is visually great, some of the most creative and unique shots for early TNG. I'm also giving this episode 5 phasers. I don't care, I liked it a lot. Okay, so first things first, Star Trek has a lot of time travel related episodes. So when I first rewatched this, I was a bit worried because there's some great time travel episodes later on. But lo and behold, this episode was phenomenal in my opinion, introducing a genuine existential threat to Picard. The Enterprise picking up a shuttle that contains Picard from the near future, more or less causing the crew to try and figure out what the hell is going on, and leaving Picard to have a crisis of faith. He has to struggle with the idea that he potentially abandoned his crew and left them all to fight some horrible fate on their own, which is out of character for him. He hates his future self for what he represents, a break in his code, something that he would never do, at least not intentionally. This episode beautifully humanizes Picard, showing off his more flawed, imperfect side in a way that doesn't ruin his character. Plus, they use time travel in a super unique way, even showing time travel could be dangerous and completely screw up your internal biological clock. That's actually an idea I've never really seen explored before in a time travel story. The emotional climax and solution of this episode might just be one of my favorite conclusions to any Trek episode. I'm sorry to repeat myself, but I think this is another 5 phasers. On paper, I should love this episode. I mean, it's got Data and an interesting ethical dilemma. But the issue is, they create 2 plots for this episode, and I don't think either gets a good amount of time to develop into anything of substance. The weakest part of this episode is Wesley's B plot. He kinda has the same sort of plot over and over again, and his personality doesn't really strike me enough to get too engaged in him. Not because he's a kid character, many series have great kid characters. Ahsoka and the Clone Wars comes to mind when I think of great kid characters in science fiction. But Wesley never interested me too much as a character because, well, I just think he's kind of bland, at least at this point in time of the series. Though the Data plotline is pretty interesting. The idea of replying to a transmission to a young girl from a planet who doesn't even know you exist is an interesting conundrum, especially since this could violate the Prime Directive. I wish this was a primary focus earlier on. Not to hate, but there's better episodes that discuss the nuances of the Prime Directive, and while this does do it fine enough, again, there's much better episodes that dive into this. Though, despite the good ideas here, the episode's pacing just also happens to drag. I feel like it needed to get to the point sooner and took its time adding to the scenario. At least let us see the situation on the alien world sooner. I'm giving this episode 3 phasers. There's something great here, but it needed to be cooked a bit differently. This episode is important for introducing us to one of the most iconic enemy factions in all of Trek, maybe even in all of sci-fi. The Borg. You probably know them. You know, robot guys, resistance is futile. Those guys? Anyways, they're introduced because of Q. More or less, Q appears and is like, I don't think you guys should keep exploring. And that makes Picard say more or less, we're ready for anything. Q being Q, the little trickster he is, basically gives them a monkey's paw sort of idea, and sends them way out from where they've been in the galaxy before, which makes them encounter the Borg, something they've never even experienced before. It's interesting because this episode does show Starfleet and the Enterprise aren't the biggest fish in the pond. There's a good reason they're exploring, but there's also things that they simply can't be ready for because they've never seen it. And also the Borg introduction here is so strong. Seeing the massive cube ship and being on the inside and seeing their weird biomechanical organs and stuff like that. It's really great sci-fi and it's also kind of horrific. And as usual, a Q episode is usually pretty good. 4 phasers. Starting this episode off with the crew having a game of poker is such a great touch. This will actually become a recurring event in the series as the crew tend to have a weekly poker game, just for fun. I always love it when shows have characters hanging out and just enjoying each other's presence. It shows that the characters are bonding there instead of just something that's made of circumstance. Farscape is also pretty good at this. Sorry, there I go again, taking an opportunity to talk about Farscape again, my bad. This episode is about Worf. He's given a lot of great character work here, introducing us to a Klingon emissary named Kalar, who has a romantic past with Worf. Though she's actually a pretty well fleshed out character here, being half Klingon, half human, and clearly has some deeply buried self-hatred for her Klingon side. Worf was never great at expressing his emotions, though really I don't think most Klingons are. Yet clearly they both have feelings for each other. She also tries to get out of him why they stopped their relationship, while Worf is just trying to be as professional as he can be and keep his feelings to himself. He doesn't really know how to respond to them. We get to examine how different Klingons' love and relationships are. It's a great story for Worf, and we humanize a lot of Klingon culture a ton in this episode. There's a lot of complicated feelings here, and it doesn't try to tie everything into a neat little bow, instead leaving some things complicated and messy, much like real-life relationships can be. I think this is pretty solid for phasers. I love an episode where the whole crew can get involved. Basically, we see the Enterprise doing a military exercise, trying to prepare for the imminent Borg threat, whenever they may show up. In this scenario, the crew is forced to deal with Kohlrami, a man from a species known for their incredible tactics and is completely insufferable. But this is intentional. He's not written poorly, he's actually written really well. You're not supposed to like him. The crew puts up with him to maybe learn some sort of tactical knowledge of some sort as they play their little simulation, or I guess you could call it a game, but not really. Half the crew is placed on the old and basically abandoned vessel, the USS Hathaway. Which, I want to add here, the Hathaway is probably my favorite Star Trek ship design. It just looks so cool. I especially love the 4 engines on the back making this sort of square shape. It's a visually nice and interesting design. But anyways, the reasoning for why half the crew is on the Hathaway is so that they can learn to fight at a disadvantage. It's usually good to learn to do that. Plus, someone who seems to have the advantage can often make mistakes due to a sense of security. Everyone here gets their own little plotline and everyone makes a difference. Even Wesley. Okay, that sounded mean, but he's usually not involved in the crazy action because, he's a child. But there's a lot of great moments here, like when Data beats Kohlrami at a strategy game and Kohlrami rage quits. Data literally saying, I tried to stop playing to win. Because, look, I love this because it's basically saying that Data trolled Kohlrami, a known master strategist, so hard that he rage quit. Do you see why Data is one of my favorite characters? So yeah, this is a great episode. 5 phasers. And yeah, that's about it. That was a lot to go through, but we're finally here, which now leads me to what I promised. The Star Trek TNG Starter Pack. The collection of episodes I'd recommend if you want to get into the series. In Season 1, I'd recommend Encounter at Farpoint, Symbiosis, and Conspiracy. Yeah, like I said, there really isn't much from Season 1 I'd recommend. I obviously gotta recommend the first episode because it introduced everything, but I think everything else can be skipped for the most part. The episodes either don't really say much or develop anything to note, or are just really bad. Now, for Season 2, I recommend Elementary Dear Data, A Matter of Honor, Measure of a Man, Contagion, Time Squared, Q-Who, The Emissary, and Peak Performance. A pretty solid pack of episodes, but not too many either. I'd say this makes for a great introduction, but you don't gotta follow what I say. Yeah, believe it or not, this is all just a recommendation. I'm not gonna be that kind of asshole that tells you you can't watch it however you want. Hell, you could opt right into Season 5 or 6 for all I care. Like I said earlier when I was talking about the BH Ultra video, I feel like nowadays we overly incentivize watch guides. And while there's nothing really wrong with that, I also think allowing people to develop their own relationship with art is deeply important. You want to start with the movies, Deep Space Nine, Discovery? Go ahead. Honestly, if this video at least has one of you try and give Star Trek an open-minded shot, then I'd say that's a win. I have a deep love for this series. It's just as important to me as Star Wars and Doctor Who. And if I spoke to everyone around my age and showed everyone that, hey, Star Trek isn't just for that one uncle or aunt you know, but it can be for everyone. A lot of Star Trek still holds up today, and I'd even go as far to say Star Trek is still incredibly important. Nowadays, I think it's easy to show that we're heading for a dystopia, if we're not already living in one. And yeah, I completely understand that feeling. It's pretty valid. To say dystopic fiction has no merit would be stupid. So much of my favorite stories are dystopic in nature. But I'd also say that trying to show everyone the best of humanity, to show empathy and understanding, can be a much more difficult task at times. You have to push aside all your cynicism and grunginess in life to show everyone what we can be. And Star Trek has always tried to do this. Sure, it's not always perfect, but have we ever, as a species, been perfect? Star Trek shows us a world that to us is a utopia. But even they have their own issues, their own imperfections. The chase towards that horizon is what matters. And those who chase it are the ones who will make it better after them. That's why I think more people need to get into Star Trek. To see that it was never about these perfect people doing everything without flaws, but rather that our ability to grow, to learn, and to empathize has always been our greatest strengths. Beyond our tech and our weapons and our made-up borders, our ideas and connections are what allow us to reach the stars. So I hope I can help you get into this series, and give you a little entry point to start with. If I haven't, that's fine. I hope you find joy in the things that you're interested in. But hey, at least you gave it a shot, right? And that's what matters. And that's pretty much all I gotta say for this video. Did this video really get you into Star Trek? If it did, I actually am really glad. You could tell me all about it in the comments below. Or if you've just never been interested in Star Trek, but maybe I helped you maybe see a different lens on it, I'm glad I could. Honestly, I want to start doing longer form videos, but my recent schedule with college and how my classes have been kind of shifted around to make it a different work schedule can sometimes be a little iffy. Kind of have to get into a new groove of things at all. But I'm still trying to make sure I make videos pretty frequently for y'all. And I am working on a couple things in the background like I usually am. I'm never truly working on one video at a time, but more of finishing one and then starting the smaller processes to another one. But if there is a wait between vids, my bad, y'all. And if you're sort of confused or maybe coming here from, I don't know, my Superman vid or something like that, yeah, I kind of just cover whatever I want. I don't know why I'm explaining this again. I feel like I explain this every episode. And yes, if you're wondering, I do not write a script for these outros. I kind of just ramble on just to give it a more human element. But yeah, I hope you all really enjoyed. And if you didn't, that's okay. I'm not here to please everyone. In fact, I'd say it's pretty healthy to not please everyone. But with all that being said, I'll see you next time.